Welcome back to Between the Before and After, a podcast about the stories that shape us. I'm your host, Coach John McLaren, and each episode I bring you an inspiring guest with a moving story that shines a light on the power of the human spirit. I'm excited to share this story with you, so let's dive in.
What would it be like to go from being married and in what seems like a good relationship to divorced and homeless? I don't think anyone ever expects to find themselves in a situation in life like that. Yet that was where Jamal found himself at a point in his life. Maybe it was the lowest point in his life. We're going to explore that today. So welcome to the show, Jamal.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be on the show. Been looking forward to this conversation.
That's awesome. And for those who are tuning in recently after the release, Jamal and I were going to record earlier, but he got buried, or his town got buried under about 8 feet of snow, legitimately 8 feet of snow. And so we ended up having to reschedule. So I've been really looking forward to this as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate your flexibility. We are surviving for sure.
That's good. Yeah, you're not in your normal recording studio. So, before we dive into your story, kind of where are you at? Obviously, currently, right? Very currently, you're staying with a friend there who's taking care of you during this kind of difficult time here. But just letting people know where you're at, what you're doing presently, and then we're going to explore your story and see kind of how you got to this place.
Yeah, totally. My wife and I live in a little mountain community about an hour and a half east of Los Angeles in Southern California. That's where we reside full time. And I'm a life coach by profession. I'm author, podcaster. That's currently what I'm doing today.
That's awesome. And when we hear Los Angeles, like we don't think about snow and winter. It's not something that sort of comes to mind. And yet here you go. Is this like a record snowfall? Like has San Bernardino County ever seen this much snow?
Well, where we live in the mountains, so Los Angeles doesn't get a ton of snow, but we are actually we're over a mile high, so we're over 5,000, 5,200 feet is kind of, give or take some. And there's a lot of mountain communities, and it's typical for us to get snow during the winter. We get all the seasons, but our area where I currently live, there has not in recent history been any record of 91 inches of snow. I mean, that's like 8 feet of snow. Cars completely submerged. It was just too much for the community to handle without extra help.
Yeah. I mean, were you like climbing out the second floor window to get out of your house, or like what was that like?
Well, we had there was a lot. We had a tree fall. Trees. So we live in the middle of kind of a national forest area. So with that kind of snow, a lot of the trees will break. So we had trees falling. One fell on our cars, actually, on the driveway, and blocked the entrance. Our cars, thankfully, were submerged in snow, so it fell on top of the snow. So we're not yet sure if it caused how much damage it caused, but it took out the power lines. So we lost power, we lost communication. Cell phone coverage, all of that is dependent upon power and internet because we don't have natural cell coverage here where we live. So it was, so we had to hike out on foot, and we hiked for about 5 miles actually to get to a place where there was power. And then we were able to get a ride to a family's home that lives about 20 minutes away in a nearby town, also in the mountain. So
this is already like a kind of like a crazy story, right?
I know.
You're hiking out. And you're hiking out 5 miles on foot with no cell coverage. So, I mean, that's a little bit hazardous. Like those, I mean, I live in Canada. We get like some pretty serious winter, but, it'll be extremely rare for us to get like 91 inches of snow too, and we live just east of the mountains in Alberta, Canada. But, so you get like kitted up and you're like, all right, like we have to leave because we have no power. Was there any like radio or anything like that? Or how did you know where to go or what direction to go?
Well, the day before we ventured out, this is when the storm ended, and we were just kind of assessing what the situation. And we were going to walk, so we were without power, but we were going to walk into the little town. As we were walking into town, we ran into some neighbors who informed us that the grocery store, the main grocery store for the town we live in, had totally collapsed. The ceiling or the roof had fallen in. So that was eye-opening. That really kind of gave us some impetus. Like, this is, sometimes you're not sure how bad something is until you see the results of a storm like that. So when we heard that, we knew we need to get out of here. So we walked up the road just to the point where we did get a little bit of cell coverage, and we were able to make arrangements to get to somebody's home who did have power at another part of our town. that hike was about 3 miles, and we knew we were going to have to walk because they were not able to plow the roads. The cars were completely submerged up to the roof and snow. So there was no driving. We knew we had to hike. So we prepared a couple carry-on luggages that my wife and I were going to carry. And then we put a couple backpacks on and carry-ons, and we hiked in all that snow to get to safety.
Man, how are you not like sinking up to your waist or deeper in snow as you're trying to hike through this, or were you? And was it like fairly fluffy snow, or is it coastal like wet snow?
It was a little bit, it was fluffy for the most part. It was heavy. We in some places we were, we would be waist deep, and but we were trying to stay on the tracks, like in the road where some 4-wheel drives or vehicles had kind of made a little bit of a track. We were able to kind of get into those grooves and walk in that, and that was more helpful. But it was a challenge for sure.
Those character building experiences, man.
Totally.
Because you don't want to. Totally. I mean, I of course I'm just thinking here you're up in some mountain community and whatnot, and you don't necessarily want to get lost in the woods either as you're trying to find your way out. So we were on, we eventually, once we got off our road that we live on, there were some more of the main roads, and those were a little bit more passable. Yeah. Good. Well, that's already like a pretty cool, I mean, I say it's a cool story. I mean, it's not a fun experience to go through, but let's call it a character building experience. But we already know that you're a fairly resilient guy just from the life that you've already lived. And so let's rewind the clock a little bit here and kind of go back to how things started for you. Because I think probably when growing up, maybe we have this idea of what our life is going to look like. And what was that like for you? And did you have an idea of what you thought your life was going to turn out like?
Well, that's a great question. Growing up, and I always like to kind of talk about my parents for a little bit, because they obviously, as all of us, our parents shape us. But my dad, grew up in East Africa, a little island off the coast of East Africa, and originally from India, Indian heritage. My mother grew up in Ohio, the Midwest or eastern part of the United States, and both of my mom's families, my mom and my dad's families, a lot of history of just generational poverty and struggle. So when I was born, when I came into this world, I was always aware. I always had questions. I was like to say very observant. From the earliest that I can remember, I always wanted to know the question why. I was always asking the question why. So observing my dad and observing my mother, I picked up on this sensation or this idea that life was a struggle. And so I actually envisioned that for my life, struggle, that life was going to, and that's the messages that were, consciously sometimes, but a lot of it unconsciously was delivered to me, was that in order to make it in life, you have to work really hard. You have to struggle. It's not easy. And if you work really hard, you may survive, possibly just survive, not thrive, but survive. And that caused a lot of angst. And I didn't know what to do with that. It's kind of the backdrop in the way I view life and the world.
Yeah. So, and if I may ask, what island was it that your dad grew up on?
He grew up in Zanzibar, which is part of Tanzania now.
Yeah. Because I was thinking off of East Africa, there are a few places where Indians went and settled. Actually, quite a few, including South Africa as well. I spent some time living in South Africa, and maybe a lot of people don't actually realize that, but there's actually a fairly sizable population there as well. How did he, if I may ask, how did he end up in Ohio, or how did he end up meeting your mom?
It's a great question. They were, my mother and my father both belonged to this international organization back, it was the late 60s. And there was this guy who was from Ohio. He traveled the world and was really kind of moved at seeing the, struggling folks in the third world that were struggling. And he wanted to connect people just relationally to the, people, in Africa and in Asia and these places he wanted to connect the Western world to the, more remote places. And so he started this organization, really a pen pal organization to connect people. And he thought that was the best way to have needs met. So he put out an ad in the East African newspaper. My dad eventually moved from Zanzibar to Kenya and settled in Mombasa, Kenya. And my dad was reading the East African newspaper at the time, and he saw this little ad, and he wrote to the address, said that, write to this address if you want a pen pal. So he wrote to this address. My mother was recently had moved to Columbus, Ohio, which is the big city for her, and was working at a job, and somebody had brought in a little radio and had it in their little cubicle, and she heard a commercial on the radio. It says, if you would like a pen pal, write to this address. Same guy, same organization. So she wrote it on the same time, and that's how they got paired up, and they wrote to each other for about 6 years. They were pen pals, and that's how my dad, and he proposed in a letter. Eventually he proposed. They never met. She accepted.
Wow. That's pretty remarkable. My wife's from Australia and I'm from Canada, and we met, and we had like a long distance sort of relationship, but we had the internet. Now it wasn't as good as it is now. Like, we didn't really have high quality video calling, but we had Skype where we could do audio calling over the internet. It was still a little bit laggy. This is back in the early 2000s, but I think I just highlight that because here we are, like we're talking a video, 21st century video recording a podcast, this amazing technology. Here they are writing letters to each other, which you would write a letter and wouldn't get a reply for, I don't know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that, however long it took.
Yeah. It was airmail. I still remember the envelopes. They kept the envelopes,
the blue ones. Yeah,
airmail. Yep. And airmail, and then sometimes by ship. It would take sometimes a letter, they would get 1 or 2 a month from each other. That was about it.
Yeah, that's something to think of. That's a really cool story though. And so they ended up falling in love and how like I want to say like serendipitous almost, like how random is it that like one person reads an ad, another person hears a radio ad, and somehow they get matched up to write letters. Like, I'm not sure your thoughts on divine providence, but I'm like, man, it feels like that was one of those things that was like meant to be.
Oh, absolutely. And they had that sense as they were writing, because my dad, he comes from a devout Muslim family, and it's really kind of not done. My mother was a devout Catholic. She actually wanted to be a nun before they got engaged. So the fact, it was so unlikely, but when they were writing to each other, they had this sense that they both knew each other, that this was right. Eventually he proposed, and she accepted without having ever met or even spoke on the phone. Wow. So
had they sent photos? Did they even know?
Okay. Yeah, I think they had exchanged photos, and by this time they had been writing, for 6 years, so they really had a good sense of who they were. But she applied for him to come, and she ended up meeting him in Europe, and then because I guess the immigration rules were, you had to at least have met. So she, at that point, and so she had went over to Germany to meet. He made his way from Africa to Europe, and she met him there, and then applied for him to come, and the rest is history.
Oh, that's quite something. And so did both your parents maintain their faiths? Like, did he maintain his Muslim faith and your mom maintain her Catholic faith?
Yes. So my mother maintained her devout Catholicism all her life. My dad, maintained, he was a very devout Muslim. He eventually, in his later years, converted to Catholicism, which is a whole story in itself. So that's very unlikely, but he did. Yeah. But growing up, I grew up going to the mosque on the weekends.
Yep.
And then Catholic schools during the week. So that was also something I was curious about, always asking questions, what are the differences here? How do you know who's right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's the kind of questions you would find yourself asking. Well, how do you know who's right? Because dad believes this and mom believes this, and you both like really believe with all of your hearts and so on. And and so even that would I guess kind of shape your perspective. But so you talked about but both of them maybe came from a place of struggle, and so that sort of messaging, that sort of energy was kind of imparted on you, sort of growing up and whatnot. So you had this idea that, well, life's going to be hard, and I'm going to have to work hard, and maybe I'll get lucky and kind of make it, And so, as you get out of high school, where did your life go from there?
Well, out of high school, I became, I was kind of repeating history on my mother's side. So I became a dad. I was, my girlfriend became pregnant. So I literally had a daughter on my 18th birthday. Wow. We had the same birthday. So she was born, I was a senior in high school, and I graduated within a month of that. So my daughter was born in May. I graduated in June. So I needed a job. I was a young dad. I needed to try to figure out how to provide for my daughter. So I ended up becoming, it took about a year, but I ended up becoming a corrections officer, got a job in the state penitentiary. And that's a whole story in itself. And then I ended up working there for about 4.5 to 5 years. And that was instrumental for me, for sure.
Yeah. So, and that's something, and I'm not quite sure how old you are. What year was it when you were graduating?
1993. I graduated class of 93.
There we go. Okay. So again, things just sort of like the time and whatnot. How did your parents respond to you fathering a child? And I believe, I guess, were you out of wedlock at that time?
Absolutely. Yeah. I was out of wedlock. I had, my teenage years were filled with like a lot of struggle. They interpreted that as a lot of rebellion. I was a really angry, confused, searching person, and so I had went through, from my dad's perspective, it was very shameful what I was doing, how I was living. My mother she just was exacerbated. She didn't know what was wrong with me. But I was looking back at that period of my life, and I could see that there was trauma that was coming to the surface, and I just didn't know how to deal with it or even understand what it was. But I was always somebody that I was never okay with just going through the motions. I wanted to experience life the way it was. I wanted to get to the root of things, and I was always asking questions. And so for a long time, I just felt stuck. I didn't realize life seemed like a joke. We're here to slave away and grind away so we can earn money, so we can pay the bills. But for what? What's the main purpose here? And this existential angst or anxiety of living never seemed to leave. So that was a backdrop, and that was a struggle that they could see, but they didn't understand it, and in the same way, I didn't understand it. So I was reacting to it.
Yeah. You think about both under sort of maybe Islamic culture and Catholic culture, where sin is seen as incredibly shameful. And I'm not Catholic. I've had Catholic friends growing up, but it often seems like there's like a burden of guilt and shame laid on people to bring them into compliance, if you will. It doesn't seem like a healthy way. So I am a Christian, for the record. I don't wear it on my sleeve and walk around pronouncing it loudly or anything, but it just seems like a really difficult way to try to shape any kind of spiritual relationship when it starts with this heavy burden that's like, filled with shame and guilt and whatnot. And so, I can imagine both of them, though, having been raised in those environments, obviously, then watching you struggle with this. And again, they're not doing this in malice, or it's more a case of they're just going from what they learned. And it's so interesting as we look back now and we reflect on, kind of how our parents, how they were raised, how they were shaped, how their experience shapes our experience. And I mean, there's a whole other world to be explored when it comes to like intergenerational trauma and things like that. That might have to be a separate conversation, but just to connect some of those dots and you go, oh, I get it now. Like they were doing the best they could with what they knew at the time.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. They totally were. And, and they're the idea that I think they approach life with is, that God is somebody that, they wanted to know that there's more to this life. I mean, this life was almost a precursor to the next life. So if we can get through this, we can survive and just make it, then the next life will be, that's really where living is, So it was almost like, and I picked up on that, and I couldn't understand that. How could this life just be a throwaway in order, like what, looking forward to the next life, as opposed to, what's the point of this? And I can never get to the root of that. And their struggle, their suffering, I could see the trauma that they had, and their faith, as devout as they were, this is just my perception, it didn't seem to touch the trauma. It didn't seem to address the roots of their trauma. And I was interested in getting to the roots. And so, but I just didn't know. So if it wasn't their faith, then what was it? And that led me on my own journey eventually.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So your daughter's born, and you realize, okay, I gotta like man up and take some responsibility here. You made a commitment. You said, I'm gonna do my best to provide. I'm not running away from this responsibility. And you get a job as a corrections officer, like at 18.
I was 19 actually when I started working in the prison.
Man, totally. That seems awfully young to be. What prison was it?
Well, it was in Ohio, and it was a minimum medium security. It was a state penitentiary. So basically, when somebody's convicted of a felony, they would get sentenced to whatever time they were going to do. So that's the prison I worked at. So there was obviously a number of prisons, but I worked at a minimum medium security prison. And it was a life-changing experience for me. The only reason I got the job there, I have an older brother, he's a year and a half older. He actually got a job as a corrections officer before I did. And the reason he and myself got the job is because my dad actually knew somebody who was kind of high up in Ohio. They call it the state title of that department. It's called the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. So somebody who worked at the corporate level, he knew somebody. He got my application pulled. I got an interview. I was really not qualified. Most of the folks that worked there had a law enforcement background. They were either had got a degree in criminology or they worked in law enforcement. I had none of that. So I really was not qualified for the job, but it was instrumental and providential. I believe that I ended up working there.
Oh man, I think and I mean, I guess it's probably good you weren't getting dumped into a max security with like the most hardcore of human beings and criminals at 19 years old kind of thing, but you're still walking into an environment with incarcerated individuals who've committed crimes. And, if I may, like, I think still relatively young and naive at 19 years old, what was it like when you kind of walk through there? Maybe you got a bit of a tour before you like accepted the job or something, but you walk in your first day on the job, and what's it like?
Well, we went through an academy, to try to prepare us. And, I'm sure that helped a little bit. It was just overwhelming. I remember feeling very overwhelmed. The idea of needing to control other human beings to try to make them follow the rules. Our job as corrections officers was to maintain security of the institution. But you realize, we were, give you an example, in the dormitory, and this was in a dormitory setting, you would have, a dormitory would have 500 inmates. There would be 4 corrections officers that were in charge or overseeing 500 inmates. So the ratio is not, so it's an illusion in many ways of control, but you did have to maintain a certain presence to get, to be able to, for guys to respect you and listen to you and for you to be able to do your job. That was extremely taxing because one of the things I realized pretty quickly is that you don't actually control other people. I
don't know a lot about your I was like, I don't know a lot about your physical stature. Like, are you a big fella, a small fella? Like,
no, small. So 5'5", probably, at the time I probably weighed 150 pounds, so small, small guy,
not the most imposing presence. And you think, oh man, I've got to maintain some semblance of order here. What was your kind of like first challenging encounter with an inmate?
Oh my goodness. Well, my first challenging encounter was probably, I feel like I didn't have, I'm sure there were others, but I just don't remember them at the time. But the one that comes to mind is we had a little mini riot situation. So, we had to count on our shift, you counted at least 3 times a shift. And when it was count time, everybody had to be, in the minimum medium security prison. It was kind of like the military where there's barracks, a dormitory, you would have bunk beds and everybody had to be on their bunk while, when it was count time, everybody was supposed to be locked in. You would have these, they call them bays. Each bay housed about 50 guys. And then there would be these crash gates that would be, these big gates that would lock these guys in. So everybody had to be locked down. And when you went to count, you would open up the gate, go in, and you'd be in a bay and count the guys. And then when you're done, you'd lock the gate again. So everybody was locked down. Well, it was during count time one time, and we were going through counting. And after count's over, you have to tell guys if they have, every inmate has a job to do in the prison. So certain guys were supposed to go to the chow hall, the kitchen, to prepare food. And so we knew who those people were. It was our job to make sure that they were notified that they had to go to work after count was cleared. So we did our count, and I woke a guy up, and he was asleep in his bed. And we said, you have to go to work today. So when count's cleared, you need to be waiting at the door. And he just looks and he goes, I'm not going to work today, which was not something that they could just do. And so,
right.
To make a long story short, this developed really quickly into a conflict. So when we tried to put handcuffs on him to take him to the hole, so the hole was like jail within jail. You couldn't refuse a direct order like that. He ended up getting violent with us and started attacking. Well, I was just myself, and my partner was with me, and he started attacking us. And this was a big fella. I mean, he was probably 6 foot tall, over 300 pounds, big guy, and we were outmatched, and we were in the middle of the bay when this happened. So we're surrounded by 50 guys in here. And so there's a lot of commotion, a lot of yelling.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he decides to run out of the bay, and he runs down the hallway running away from us. And so we have to go after him. So my partner runs after him, and all of a sudden I see him jump on my partner and starts pounding on my partner, attacking him. So I run after him to assist, but I forgot to lock the gate behind me.
Oh man.
And when that happened, we call it a rapid response team that comes and to try to subdue the inmate. So this rapid response team was coming down the hall. So it looked like 10 corrections officers jumped on this guy to get him down, to get him handcuffed.
Yeah.
Well, when these other guys saw that, they thought he was getting abused. These 50 guys ran out and was preparing we're going to kill you. And so it developed into a little riot situation. And they surrounded us, and I literally thought that I was going to die that day. So that was
because you're outnumbered, and and it's so interesting, the observation that you maintain this illusion of control when it's really, if the people, if they decided to sort of rise up with their numbers, what are you going to do?
Yeah, it's an illusion for sure. Well, I realized at that moment that what I had been doing was I was trading my life away for a paycheck, and I realized in that moment, it's like my life. This suddenly did not seem like what I had always said I wasn't going to do, which was to leverage my life for survival, which is what I witnessed my parents doing growing up. Yeah, I found myself in that moment confronted with, what is my life worth?
Yeah.
And, really challenged that, I had to ask that question. So it's a turning point.
No kidding. And so during this time working, were you maintaining a relationship with the mother of your child?
Yes, we ended up getting married. So we ended up getting married, and so I was a husband, young father. Absolutely.
Yeah, but eventually this leads to you being divorced. How did that? When you got married, did you go into it thinking, okay, this is going to make it work? Like marriage is going to make this work. We're going in this for life. Like there was this idea that okay, this is my life partner, or what was the idea going into it?
So my thought going in when I got married, I had a child when I was 18, got married right around 19, right around the same time I got the job as a corrections officer. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that was done because it was the right thing to do. This is what I was taught. And I actually had become a convert to Christianity at the time, became an evangelical Christian, really wanted to do to do what was correct. And people were advising me, this is what you need to do. And so I was doing all of that. I was doing what I knew to do. But one of the things, so working in the prison, I began to understand something. Now I saw it first in other people, but I began to understand. I always tell people, I'm a firm believer in the goodness of humanity, but I didn't always believe that. It took me working in a prison to actually come to that conclusion. People say, well, that's crazy. How did you come to that conclusion working in a prison? And what I saw in a nutshell was I realized that everybody has a story. And behind that story, is who they actually are. But most people never actually meet who they are. They never come in contact with who they are. They're just living out of this story, whatever that story is. And so for the guys in prison, all that behavior, all that, we lock these folks away and call them criminals, and these are bad people. But the more I worked in that prison, the more I realized I started to hear their stories, learn their backgrounds, and I realized this is just a story. It's not who they are. And I saw that in other folks, but I didn't realize that I also was living out of a story. And so my story had two main pain points. And one of them is abandonment, the sense of, just being abandoned. And a lot of that has to do with the dynamic that I had with my own mother. My mother had went through a ton of abuse growing up, had never really dealt with it. She was profoundly depressed when I was a child. I just remember her, being in and out of depression, sleeping a lot, having a lot of health issues. So that really affected me because I always felt like I was on the verge of losing my mother. I never felt like I could connect with her. I never felt like she was there for me. So there was one of the main pain point was abandonment.
Yeah.
The other issue that kind of came from my dad's side was never enough. So abandonment and then not enough. These were two main pain points so when I approached God, my relationship with God, it was always through that lens of need to do more, be more, perform better. So this led me into leaving a job as a corrections officer. I ended up becoming a pastor.
Okay.
Did that went to college, studied, got the degree, went and then became a church planter and actually became a pastor. And I was on this quest to help people, to heal people. I got a lot of that inspiration from my time as a corrections officer because I developed a real hunger for people and helping people see beyond their own story. And I did this work for almost 20 years as a
pastor.
Often. Well, I was an actual pastor in that position for about 5 years, but off and on, since the time I became a convert to evangelical Christianity to the point of my divorce was almost 20 years. And I did not realize, I would have said this, but I didn't realize that a lot of the things I was trying to do for folks out here, the folks I was trying to bring healing to and help people change and up-level their life, I didn't realize that you can only do that to the degree that you've experienced that yourself. And so I was really on the run for myself. And so eventually that all came crashing down. And it was when I went through the divorce. So I never had an intention to, I was till death do us part. That was my intention.
Yeah.
But it was a slow process of beginning to see through some of these belief systems that caused me to actually start facing what was going on in here, which eventually led me to the divorce.
Yeah. And so, and along the way, I guess your wife at the time, was sort of observing this transformation sort of taking place, kind of the questions you have. Was your wife religious as well?
She was, yeah. She really went along with my journey, became the pastor's wife, did the whole thing. But really the question of who am I, right? That was a question that she was asking. She always felt in the shadows of that. That was a question I was asking myself. Who am I? And the more we asked that question, the closer we got to our pain, because what I've discovered is in order to really discover who it is that you actually are, you have to go through, because you are on the other side of that story. Wherever that story is, you are on the other side of that. Well, I didn't realize that. So I was getting closer and closer to the pain. The more I deconstructed my belief system, because to me, and this is probably a whole other conversation, but religion became my drug of choice. It became the thing that distracted me from myself. So the more I could focus on what I was doing to help people, to build the church, to serve God, whatever that was, it distracted me from what was this deep sense of foreboding sense of doom that I had lived with my whole life, and I didn't know what to do with it. So when I started deconstructing that and walking away, I eventually stepped down from my position as a pastor because I was on this road to discover what's real, what's not. And as I deconstructed a lot of the belief systems, it led me closer and closer to my own pain points. And that's what caused the marriage to unravel eventually.
Yeah. And maybe this is a pointed question, I guess, but do you see yourself as being the driver of this kind of unraveling, and I mean, I'm trying to ask the question without judgment, but with observation, I guess. Do you observe that, like, this journey that you're going on of discovering yourself and getting closer and closer to your pain and whatnot, being sort of the driving factor to the marriage dissolving? And at what point did you know it's over?
Well, I think there was a point where I left, where we'd had this huge blow up, and I ended up leaving. And my wife and I both agreed, like, you need to get away. You're going through something really deep here, and she was like, I need the space, and you need space to get clear. So I went away for a couple of weeks and stayed with a friend, a different state. We were there, and it was at that point I knew that we weren't coming back in, because she was very clear. She just said, I'm not, whatever we had before, like, we can't go back to that. And I didn't know what else to be at that point. So at that point I knew it was, and I had this sense for a long time that a lot of the motivation for our life, even our marriage, was out of obligation or duty. We did things because it was the right thing to do. but not because it was a desire. We were not in touch with ourself, who we actually are and what our desires were. So therefore the decisions we made were based out of a whole other framework of duty. I always say that that gas tank will run out quickly.
It will. Were there any other children in the picture?
So just my daughter. We just had one daughter. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so at the time of divorce, had she like left home and gathered you together for a number of years?
Yeah, she was over 18. So, I mean, she was probably around 20, 21, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And of course, I'd be curious, like what's her as an observer. And I don't know if you've had conversations with her about, because I think you're a very heart-centered guy. And I think at some point you definitely want to sit down with her and go, let me explain what kind of took place here. Give you an idea, at least what took place.
Absolutely. So this was a process, explanation for it really affected her because she grew up in her friend circle growing up, she was the only one that had parents that weren't divorced. And she kind of prided herself on that. Like when my parents, they're committed to each other, they stay together. She felt a sense of security and stability in that. And then even though she was an adult, when we split up, it really affected her, and she couldn't understand it. She was like, who are you guys? And, and she was, I don't know who you are. And then therefore I don't know who I am. And that's because we spent a lot of time living out of who we were not who we were. And so I can understand the confusion that caused for her.
Yeah. Fascinating again. I mean, I just think all human behavior is really, really quite fascinating. And, but I think you would have been maybe well positioned in one sense to kind of help go through that with her as well, and what a learning and growth experience. And I imagine overall going through that it had a positive impact on your relationship in the future.
Oh, it was transformative, because the more I learned, because in this process of, going into this dark place in myself and facing my own pain points and losing my marriage, losing my relationships, ultimately losing everything. I had to do the work. My path out of that was learning radical self-acceptance, learning to see the pain points that I had been running from. And I learned to see where they came from. I began to understand that a lot of these weren't even mine. They came from my history, my parents, they're going back generations of trauma. And a lot of this trauma was not even mine, but it had been put on my plate. And now I had built an entire identity around it. And so I started to have a lot of grace for myself. And what I've realized is that forgiveness or having grace for other people is not really an issue if you can have forgiveness and grace for yourself, because everybody is simply a mirror of you. And so a lot of the points of conflict that I had with my daughter growing up were really, she was mirroring back to me dynamics of my life that I was unable or unwilling to address. So the more I could have grace for those dimensions of my life, the more what started to happen was I understood her and had grace for her, and there was no agenda to fix her or make her anything other than what she was. And but that was also what I needed, and I was learning to give that to myself.
Yeah. And so a part of your story is that you ended up homeless. And I guess homeless is quite a broad term. There's everything from like addicts in the street who maybe for a number of years. What was your experience of homelessness?
Yeah, great question. My experience of homelessness was staying with friends on sleeping on their couch, literally without folks who said, "Hey, you can stay." I mean, I had no place to go, no resources, no ability, my profession. Everything was gone at that point because of the angst I was in. I was in a probably a 2-year depression, where getting out of bed was just was a chore. I had to will myself to just get up in the morning and to face the day. And so during that time, I had just beautiful people in my life that just saw me, and I considered them just the grace of God. And they said, "You can stay," and they let me have my process. And so that was homelessness for me.
Yeah, quite something. And what I guess what a testament to the power of others showing you that same grace that you had begun to learn a little bit about showing yourself, and in my work, I speak a lot about compassionate self-awareness being the foundation of transformational change. And,
absolutely.
So then at some point though, you come out of this depression and you go, okay, because I the way that I view depression, I remember there was someone who had quoted it. You could think of depressed as deep rest. And I was like, it's kind of interesting.
It is, isn't it? That's a fascinating way to put it.
And I was thinking about, man, if you spent so much of your life like trying to be something you are not, you just become drained. Yes. And everything feels so hard. And it's like your nervous system, even biologically speaking, goes into this state of like protection and going, we have to heal and rejuvenate and recuperate. And so it's this low energy state. And we look at it as like depression and whatnot. And I mean, I'm not trying to, I do have a psychology background, but I'm not trying to be a psychological professional here for those listening. But I just love the thought exercise of this, like part of it being to allow us to go through this place of recuperation, rejuvenation. And, I think about the world that we live in, it's very hedonistic. And we're encouraged to engage in a lot of emotional anesthetics, to not give place to these difficult emotions, not give space to them. But from what you're describing, maybe what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it correctly, is that you had people who maybe didn't try to fix you or necessarily lift you out of that, but were beside you as you experienced that, rather than trying to alter your emotional state because they were uncomfortable with where you were at.
Absolutely. Totally. I had a coach come into my life during that period, and he said, what you can't feel, you can't heal. What you don't feel, you don't heal. So what is it that you're feeling? And just the question of what am I feeling? And it was always, and what does that make you feel? And what does that make you feel? And what does that make you feel? And getting to the root, the deep, to the core of that was really where I started to, and I did not like the roots of that. And I was confronted with, okay, so you don't like that part of you that feels this broken, or it feels this affected or vulnerable. Well, what you're witnessing, and one of the things that had caused me such pain in my life, and I didn't know what to do with, was I had this deep-seated belief that people, when they got to know you, this was reinforced in my time as a pastor even, that people didn't really want to know you. They wanted to know a certain image of you. So if they could see you in a certain way, then that you would be a celebrity, they would love you, everything was great. Kind of like they wanted to wanted to know the after story, right? Who are you after? Which is, I love your podcast. They but they didn't really want to know you in the in-between stage, right? They didn't really want that. And I was always faced with these relationships where when somebody would see those vulnerabilities, they would ditch me, they would leave me. And I always felt that my biggest fear was, don't let people in too close, because the people who you let in close are dangerous, because they will leave you. And this wasn't conscious. This was an unconscious
back disposition. To this angst around abandonment and lack of meaningful, deep connection. Wow.
100%. Yeah. So what ended up happening is that I realized that other people were simply mirroring back those, once they saw this quote unquote vulnerable part of me and they would reject me, they were actually just mirroring back my own rejection of myself in these areas.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that it was key for me to accept the vulnerabilities, the ways I had been affected as a child, affected by a conditioning of never enough, or not there when I can't show up for you when you need me to show up for you. Because that was the dynamic with my mother. So I had to really learn to have radical compassion and acceptance for those dimensions of myself. And it was amazing that as I started to do that, literally all my relationships, it was almost like magic, began to reflect that.
And I think of an observation here, because I went through this, and I mean, it's still a journey, and maybe it's still a journey for you as well. Because again, some people get the idea that, maybe with the work that we do, that you must have it all figured out. I'm like, man, every stage of life gives you something else to try to navigate. But it was this idea of like this exchange of energy between people. So I had a sense of self-loathing towards myself, and maybe, I don't know, maybe you experienced something similar.
Sure.
And so every relationship or encounter that I would start to form or get into, again, there was this assumption, they must see me the way that I see myself, because it feels so real to me. So I imagine that they must feel that too. And that introduces this sort of awkward, uncomfortable, negative energy into it and undermines any potential relationship we might have.
Sure.
But and I think if I'm understanding correctly, this, maybe I'm sharing a similar experience, but as I began to accept who I am and the struggles that I have, and realize that, hey, I'm not actually a worthless, horrible human being for being a struggling human being.
That's
and
right.
became okay with the fact that I struggle. That all of a sudden this tension started to disappear, relationships started to change, conversations started to change. And I think that's maybe a different perspective or a similar perspective to what you're describing here. As you come to this place of acceptance, no longer is this sort of negative energy coming into an interaction when they realize that you are comfortable with where you're presently at, even if it's where you don't want to end up.
Absolutely.
So now it's okay to be in your presence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was key. That was a major turning point for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so there's this another thread here that my train of thought just went off the tracks. But anyways, yeah, I love this observation just around. It's this question here. I wonder if we're afraid to accept ourselves as we presently are, because we're afraid that in the place of acceptance we won't change.
Oh, that's a big one, right? That's a big one. Because it feels like if I acknowledge this is the way it's always going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's a major one. I don't think it's always conscious, but again, I've had many conversations, obviously now as a coach, I have these conversations.
Yeah.
I was having a conversation with somebody about acceptance around a really, really difficult physical condition they were going through. And, it elicited this response of, I will never accept this. And I said, oh, okay, why? And the response was, well, I'm not going to live the rest of my life like this. I said, oh, no. I said, I'm not talking about how you're going to spend the rest of your life, because that's the future, right? I'm not talking about the future. I'm just talking about, is this happening right now? Are you experiencing this right now? And how are you with this right now? Are you in a resistive posture towards this right now? Or are you in a posture of letting it be what it is? Because, if we talk about where's God in this, and where is God? And so I had somebody in this dark period, because I was in a very much I would say a victim, kind of this victim mindset was very rampant during this season of my life where I was, homeless and, just trying to pick up the pieces. And I had a friend say, I know you feel like what happened to you is unjust. I was blaming everybody. I had the names of all the folks that had wronged me. And she said, I know you feel like everything's unjust, but what you're experiencing, where is God not working with you in this right now? Is God not present with you in this situation? And I never it was a shift in thinking to go, well, woe is me, and these people are bad, and these people causing all my pain. But to the question of, how is this for me? What is God doing in this season right now? And it was a whole just different frequency of thinking. And that was also a game changer for me. And I started to realize, there's a lot happening right now. And if I can accept, it doesn't mean I have to like it. It doesn't have to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Acceptance doesn't mean like, but if I can accept it, I'm not resisting, because again, what you resist persists. But if you can allow yourself to be in an acceptance mode of it, then you are allowing it to teach you what it's there to teach you.
Yeah. So you referenced God, and I don't know if you're still referencing the Christian God. Are you still a Christian now practicing? Well, perspective on spirituality.
That's a great question. I don't know that I would have a label. I mean, as far as Jesus is concerned, I've never been a bigger fan. I am a huge fan. I love what Jesus taught. I resonate with the teachings of Jesus more now than I probably ever have. But I don't know that I understand God in the same way that I did in my past. I don't know that I could be defined as a Christian at this point in my journey. But it doesn't mean I disavow the faith that can be found in Christianity. But I don't see Christianity and Jesus as synonymous with each other.
Yeah. Well, Jesus actually kind of fought against the religious world in his time.
Totally.
Yeah. The religious
Yeah.
order. And so, and just think about what you're sharing there, because I had this thought as well. Because you said something really profound, this idea of like, I don't want my life to just be a throwaway. Even if there is an afterlife, I can't picture this. Like, there has to be a reason we are here. And it's like, and there's a reason we go through these experiences, and I have my own story. And of course, this episode's not about my own story, but just to say, I would not choose the experiences I went through, but I am who I am today because of what I went through.
Yes.
And I would not take them out of my past. And when I realized that, this idea that somehow we're supposed to go through life on easy, like, oh, God's in my life, life's going to be easy and cruisy and happy. And that, it's like, no. You can't, the work was not accomplished. Like, yes, those times are nice. Yes, they're an important part of life, but the real work is not accomplished when we're just walking down easy street. And I think about a poem, and I wish I could recall the author. Maybe the author is unknown, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but the premise of it is, I walked a mile with I think it was I walked a mile with pleasure. And, we laughed the whole way. But at the end of it, I didn't remember a single thing that was said. And then I walked a mile with sorrow. And not a word was said. But at the end of that mile together, it was something really, really profound. So if anyone listening, if you know it, man, I'm going to have to go look up that poem. But it's this really profound poem. Like, I walked a mile with sorrow. I'm going to Google that and see if I can find it. But yeah, this really profound experience. So, and I share that to say, for anybody who might be struggling, going through something really, really difficult right now, it's natural for us to want, like you said, we want to resist it. We don't want to go through it. It's not in our nature to want to go through hard experiences, but the ability to see that you phrase it in a beautiful way, like, why is this happening for me? What is this doing for me? And I think about this life as like the preparation ground for the next. We're being... We start out at a certain state, and then through life and through experiences, we're molded and shaped to prepare us for the next life. And that's all of a sudden gives this life meaning and purpose in my eyes.
That's beautiful. Well said. Very well said. I love that.
Well, Jamal, there's so much more that would be amazing to explore in your story, but we're out of time today. We didn't even get to marrying the woman of your dreams. Maybe we'll just allow just a minute to just segue briefly into that. How did you meet this woman?
Well, I actually did a pilgrimage. There was a thing called it's called the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. It is a 500-mile walk that starts out in southwest France and cuts across northern Spain. And a lot of people do it for a lot of different reasons. It's a great extended meditation. You're literally walking 500 miles. It takes, if you do it from start to finish, it could take you about 30 days. So I did that. Took me 30 days, and it was on that path that I got in touch with my desire to be in a committed relationship again. But I never actually, it was one of those, it was an intention I set on that journey. I didn't go on the Camino thinking that was, I discovered that was a desire I had on the Camino. And it was on the Camino that I met her. She actually lived about an hour from me in Southern California, but I met her in northern Spain at this little village out at the middle of nowhere. I met her for 5 minutes. I never even considered that this was anything. And it wasn't until much later, after I came back from the Camino, that a relationship developed. And then I realized that I had actually met her 20 minutes after I had wrote down the words of this intention on the Camino of this is what I desire. So there's a whole story in that, how that developed, but that's how I met her. Yeah, met in Spain on the Camino.
Amazing. Yeah. I interviewed a lady back in episode 70 something or other named Kathleen Donnelly Israel. And after her husband passed away at 70, she went and walked the Camino. And then at 75 went and did it again. So it seems like it's quite a profound journey. So for those, for those who are listening, who are just really intrigued by your story, they're like, man, I got to know more about Jamal. I love listening to this guy. There's something to it. Maybe even they might be interested in working with you. Where can they find you? How can they get in touch?
Yeah, probably thank you for the question. I think probably the best way for people to get in touch with me is through my website. And that is my first and last name. So JamalJivanjee.com.
Awesome. And we'll make sure we include that in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, the book and podcast, and I'm active on social media, but all those links are there at the website.
That's awesome. And the thing I always like to close out with is, if anyone's listening to your story, what is one nugget you would like them to take away from this conversation today?
Well, I would say, and this is something I didn't mention in my story, but one of the major catalysts that pulled me out of my depression was I did some research. I was compelled to start looking because I was suicidal. I wanted to die. And I had heard a voice one day that literally in my head, this voice said, if you want to die, and I look at this voice as being the divine voice, but it said, if you're so intent on dying, why don't you do research on people who have died and look up their stories? And so I started listening to people who've had near-death experiences. And I kept hearing over and over and over again, folks who had near-death experiences, they all would come back. They'd be resuscitated. These are folks who were clinically had died and had experiences beyond their life. What was communicated to them was, it's not your time. You're here. You're alive because it's not there is still work for you to do. And there's still things you're here to learn. It's not your time. So that literally that's one of the things that saved my life. I realized I'm still here because my life matters, because there's something I'm here to do. There are things here to do, and there's things I'm here to learn. So a long way to answer your question is, if you're listening to this episode right now, just the encouragement that I would give you is, you're here for a reason. You're here on purpose. And there are things for you to receive. There's things for you to give. And life is that. It's about receiving. It's about giving. It's like a breath. It's inhalation, exhalation. And you are here, and only you can receive what you're here to receive, and only you can give what you're here to give. And so you're here on purpose, and just know that your purpose isn't lost. You don't have to find it. It's actually discovering you. All you have to do is show up each day. And there's a lot more that we could say about that, but just know that you are here right on time.
I love that. Jamal, thank you so much for being generous with your time today. Thank you for being open and sharing your story. It's truly been a pleasure.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Between the Before and After. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review, because that helps this podcast to reach and inspire more people. I love exploring the stories that take place between the before and after, the powerful experiences that shape who we become, and I love human potential. I love the possibilities that lie within us. So whatever you may be up against, I hope these stories inspire you, because if you're still here, your story's not done yet, so keep moving forward.